Hey Denchbags, what's going on? It's Landon Remixes here, and it is finally time for a review of the 8th studio album from deadmau5. This one is called the W Drive 2016 album. Now before I get too deep into this review, I'd actually like to take a moment to do a shameless plug. I have a new Spotify playlist composed of down-tempo, chill, and experimental electronic music, and as you guys might know, that's not necessarily my favorite vein of electronic music, but I compiled basically everything that I like in that genre from artists all over, including deadmau5. Actually, Snowcone from this album features in that playlist. John Hopkins, Drew Lou, Survive, Eden, artists from all over the place that I've talked about this year are going to feature in this playlist, and I think you guys are really going to dig it, so I'm going to link that playlist in the Spotify description, and I thought this would be a good one to talk about it because deadmau5 actually has a few tracks in that, even ones that are outside of this album, so I definitely suggest you guys go check that one out, and hopefully follow the playlist too on Spotify, because I'm going to keep adding songs that I like as time goes on with that playlist, maybe even a couple more deadmau5 ones if we're lucky. But aside from that, let's talk about the new deadmau5 album. Now I know you guys have been anticipating my review of this for a long time, but I'm really hoping to keep this review as short and sweet as I possibly can, because honestly there's not a whole lot I can say that doesn't echo what critics have already said about this album. I remember a few months ago deadmau5 was trying to hype up this album as little as possible because he said that he hated the album, and I remember YoriDM actually did a piece on it, which made me a little bit scared of what the album was going to sound like if deadmau5 himself didn't really like it. I don't know why he said this ahead of time, maybe so people wouldn't be so disappointed when it finally came out, but he basically explained that this album was going to feel much more like a compilation than While One Is Less Than Two did. And I can definitely say that does ring true, and I think other people have talked about this as well, that this album feels a lot more like a compilation work than While One Is Less Than Two did, which had much more of a thematic feel to it, kind of based on that seven deadly sins thing that deadmau5 did. He did like a mini album composed of piano pieces and then reworked those into a full album, and I feel like While One Is Less Than Two is probably critically acclaimed to be deadmau5's best album just because it tied in so well. It was also deadmau5's longest work as an album. It had 2 separate discs and I think it probably lasted for about 2 hours in a total running time, which was just absolutely crazy. Now I know I've said this before about other artists, but this album definitely feels like a step back for deadmau5. This album actually reminds me a lot of Album Title Goes Here, which of course was the precursor to While One Is Less Than Two. It feels like deadmau5 is jumping from that and back to that rather than forward in this new kind of, I'd even go as far to say as amazing style that While One Is Less Than Two brought, just a different kind of progression as an artist, and I feel like with this one he's just not continuing in that vein. Of course I do think there are a few songs in this album that could possibly fit very snug into the While One Is Less Than Two track list, especially Snowcone, Whelk Then, and 3 Pound Chicken Wing. And those 3 actually come in succession at the end of the album, making me think that deadmau5 kind of made this album to be a journey through the history of his music as an artist, which honestly makes for a much cooler concept than I expected, but I'm not actually sure that was supposed to be a concept, but it may be an unintended one. Starting off the album with more progressive works like Fourware, then continuing into deadmau5's electro style that was big on albums like For Lack of a Better Name and 4x4=12 on tracks like 2448, and then of course getting into his more minimal experimental style at the end of the album. But then of course there are a couple outliers in this track list that probably bust my theory, most notably being Cat Thruster, which practically sounds identical to Sia from While One Is Less Than Two. One of the things I remember deadmau5 saying in an interview about this album, I think it was the one with Pete Tong on the first play of Fourware, is that the album was going to be a lot more 80s influence, and I'm not sure if I was looking forward to or not looking forward to that, but I'm kind of glad it didn't have an overwhelming 80s sound. I definitely feel like it is present on this album, but it's definitely not an overarching theme throughout the entire album. I feel like on only a couple different tracks, maybe Fourware, probably most notably Snowcone, and No Problem, probably the stronger 80s influenced track of the 2. I'd probably only say that Snowcone is 80s influence because it kind of carries that synthwave sound that was just rising up from there. A lot of artists recently have been kind of diving back into that. For example, No Taker and Survive, who did the Stranger Things soundtrack. This song kind of reminds me even of the Stranger Things theme theme for whatever reason. The thing about this album is that individually, I didn't really dislike a lot of the songs on this record. They're just so disconnected from each other that it's hard to get into this as a solid body of work, if you get what I mean at all with that. Way back in the day, before I started really getting into music, I would go back to albums and basically listen to my favorites on them, or I'd buy my favorites on iTunes. More recently, for me, buying albums has been buy the album and then listen to the whole thing, and you can only listen to the whole thing, or like the first half or whatever. With W Drive 2016 album, I feel like I myself am going back to being a 6th grade listener, because I really only want to go back to the ones that I really like on this album, and it's very hard for me to get through this thing as a standalone record. No matter how many good things I say about the tracks on this album, that disconnect is always going to be there, whether I want it to or not, and there are some really great praises I have to sing about the individual songs of this album, so I might as well just get them out of the way. Like I mentioned, there are a few really experimental tracks toward the end of this album, and I actually think these are some of his best work to date. I found myself enjoying Snowcone a lot more in the context of this album than I did as a single, along with 3 Pound Chicken Wing, which completely caught me off guard when I heard it for the first time. Mostly because the track is basically Beneath With Me, which is deadmau5's most recent song with Cascade and Skylar Grey. Except with this version, Skylar Grey's vocals are completely stripped from it, the instrumental is transposed into a different key, and then the drop is completely substituted, and I'll be real, I absolutely hated the drop on the original of Beneath With Me. I love this new version. It's so much tastier, even though it's so much more minimalistic than the original was. The drop itself is a lot more electro-oriented on the original of Beneath With Me, but I feel like with 3 Pound Chicken Wing, it just hits so much harder even with that minimal style. It actually reminds me quite a bit of the content found in No Mana's Game Over EP, which I gave my highest praises to, and will probably end up praising a little bit more in this album, if you can tell where this review's going already. No Mana's remix of Strobe is actually going to be on the CD version of this album, so I can definitely say I'm going to go and get that one, even though I probably was already going to. Another song I loved on this album, 2448. The overarching sound of this song, just its absolutely ridiculous electro house sounds, takes me back to the days when I was just falling in love with deadmau5's music originally. Actually reminds me quite a bit of Professional Griefers from deadmau5's album title Goes Here, which of course brings back some great memories for me, because album title Goes Here was actually the first deadmau5 album I ever bought. Lastly, I'd have to say that Let Go featuring Grabbits would definitely make my top 3 on this album, and it might just be my inner bias speaking because Grabbits is a friend of mine, but this one made for a really enjoyable track, partially because it is the only vocal track on the entire album, so obviously it's going to stick out from the other ones. It is a really fun and enjoyable progressive house track, but probably more than anything, I'm just excited to see this song finally come in full circle. You guys might know that this song was originally a vocal edit that Grabbits did of Silent Picture from deadmau5's While One Is Less Than Two album, and then of course deadmau5 picked up that a cappella and made it into a full song, and it's just really cool to finally see a final version of this thing put out. Although there were a couple different versions of the song that I liked a little better than the final product, of course, I'm just happy to see it released. To be short and sweet, I'd say that deadmau5 fans should like this one. The only really downside to it is that it's kind of a weak follow-up to While One Is Less Than Two, but that's really the major downside to it. Other than that, he keeps a consistent quality throughout that he retained in his older music, and I was a fan of his older stuff, so obviously I was going to like this one as well. If for some reason you haven't listened to this album yet, I'd probably suggest you go into it expecting kind of a slightly better and more concise version of album title Goes Here. I'm feeling a light 7 on W Drive 2016 album. As always, I have the Spotify linked in the description so you guys can check out this album if you haven't yet. If you have, make sure to let me know what you think about this review and also the album itself. I'm sure most people are kind of sharing similar thoughts to me on this one because I have already heard other critics kind of saying the same thing. Anyway, I'm Landon Remixes. I hope you guys enjoyed. Expect an absolutely monumental rapid fire review in the very near future, and I'll see you guys then. Peace.